And it's an old, I think it's a Jewish folktale. This is a version, Joseph Had a Little Overcoat by Sims Tabak. There's another version of it called Something from Nothing by Phoebe Gilman. And I heard a version that Tom Rawson did. He's a singer-songwriter. And I heard him sing and do a version of it recently as well. So this is Joseph Had a Little Overcoat. So has anybody here, by the way, ever had holes in your knees or maybe socks where your toes poked through because they wore through or you wore through your elbows? Well, this is a story about what Joseph did when he wore out his clothing. And I'm going to need your help with this story. We have scissors, and when we use our scissors, we go snip, 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 and then we have a needle and some thread, and we'll go stitch and sew, stitch and sew, stitch and sew. So, Joseph had a little overcoat, and he loved his overcoat. It was a beautiful overcoat. It was green, and it had brown stripes on it, and it had some plaid patches on it, and he loved this overcoat. But Joseph wore out his overcoat. He wore it all winter long. So come springtime, Joseph looked at his overcoat, and he thought, and he thought, and he said, this will not do. So he got out his scissors, and he went snip, 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 and he got out a big needle and some thread, and he went stitch and sew, stitch and sew, stitch and sew. And when he was done, he had made himself a lovely jacket. Joseph loved his jacket. He wore it around all spring long, and he strutted around the fields in it, and he farmed in it, and he went out to dine in it, and he wore it so much. In fact, he rested in the grass and right on his elbows. He wore right through his jacket, and it did not look good. So come summertime, Joseph looked at his jacket, and he thought, okay, what can I do now? He said, I know. And he got out his scissors, and he went snip, 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 and he got out a needle and some thread, stitch and sew, stitch and sew, stitch and sew. And when Joseph was done, he had made himself a very fine vest. It was a fine vest indeed. And Joseph wore that vest around all summer long, and he liked his vest so much he wore it out dancing, and he wore it to parties, and he wore it to farm, of course, because Joseph was a farmer, and he wore it so much that, you know what, come fall, Joseph had worn out his vest, plus he had grass stains all over it. So Joseph looked at the vest, and he said, you know, this is not such a fine piece of clothing anymore. What can I do now? He was very sad for a moment, and then he got a gleam in his eye, and he picked up his scissors, and he went snip, 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 and he picked up his needle and his thread, stitch and sew, stitch and sew, stitch and sew. And when he was done, he had made himself a dandy tie. Wow. Joseph liked this tie so much, he decided he'd go to the big city and see his sister. And when he was in the city, they went out to eat, they dined at very fine restaurants, and they went out to the theater, and they went out dancing, and he wore his tie every single moment he was in the city. But you know what? Joseph was not a very neat eater. And when Joseph got home, he looked at his tie, and he had dipped the tip of his tie in his soup, and it was green, and he had spilled wine all over his tie, and it had purple splotches on it. And Joseph said, I can't wear this tie anymore. So he looked at it, and he thought, I know. And he got out his scissors, smaller pair this time. Snip, snip, snip. And he got out a fairly small needle and some thread. Stitch and sew, stitch and sew, stitch and sew. And when he was done, Joseph had made himself a handkerchief. Well, it was a good thing he had a handkerchief, because now it was winter time, and Joseph had a cold. And Joseph used that handkerchief. He blew his nose in that handkerchief for 2 months long. Well, come springtime, Joseph looked at his handkerchief and he said, oh, no, I think I've blown a hole through it. This won't work. So he washed out his handkerchief, and then he got out his scissors. Very small pair this time. Snip, 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 and a small little needle and some thread. Stitch and sew, stitch and sew, stitch and sew. And when Joseph was done, he'd made himself a perfect button. And then he got out his needle and his thread again, and he attached that button right on his pants, and he used it to hold on his suspenders. Well, Joseph liked his button very much, and he cut a very fine figure. And he wore his button all the time with the suspenders. But then one day, he was in his home, he was doing a little polka, and his button popped off, and it rolled across the floor, and before he could get it, he saw it roll right into a little mouse hole. Now, I like to think that to this very day, there's a mouse sitting in that mouse hole with its feet up on a very fine footstool. But poor Joseph, now he had nothing. So what was Joseph to do? Well, he thought, and in this this time. Instead of picking up his needle and his thread and his scissors, he picked up a piece of paper and a pen, and he wrote the story that I told you today. And that's how he made something out of nothing.